I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the Speaker Program for Military and History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of our committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. The speaker tonight is Dr. Gregory Blake, speaking about Killer Bees, the Australian Independent Companies and Commandos at War 1942 to 1945. Now, a little about Dr. Blake. Gregory is a retired history teacher. He's been interested in military history since his earliest years and has written numerous articles related to military events. He has an MA and a PhD in history from the UNSW Canberra, ADFA. The subject of the PhD being the Australian Independent Companies and Commandos 1940 to 1945. He's had 4 military history books published. Killer Bees is the 5th. Gregory is an accomplished illustrator and has illustrated for magazines and books. He is one time both a trooper and an officer with 4 19th PWLH in the Australian Army Reserve. Greg now lives in Bendigo, Victoria. Now, a little bit about process before Gregory begins. He'll be asking questions as usual by the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, he couldn't get his camera to work, so tonight he'll be a voice without a picture. Jason will be operating the slideshow. You can ask questions in one of 2 ways. You can post a chat at any time up to and including the question time, address the question to everyone. When the time comes, I'll read your question out using your whatever name appears to be your computer identity. And please make sure that you're asking questions rather than a narrative. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. Gregory's happy to have cameras on, but remember that everyone can also see you, and make sure your microphones are switched off. And I now invite Gregory to speak.
Greg, you'll need to turn your microphone on.
Sorry, it turned itself off. Yeah, thank you. Okay, all right. The Killer Bees, the Australian Independent Companies and Commandos, 1942 to 1945. The Independent Companies and Commandos were unique subunits within the Australian Army during the Second World War. In relation to the independent companies, no other unit within the Army shared their training methods, their manner of operations, or their ethos. Commando squadrons, while they were derived from the independent companies, tended, with one exception, to be more traditionally orientated. The formation of the companies. Jason, could you change the slide, please? In 1940, the Chief of the Australian General Staff, Sir Cyril Brudenell-White, was in London, and he met the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir John Dill. Whilst together, they agreed for Australia to establish independent companies. This conversation was private, and Brudenell-White shared it with no one, not even his deputy. Jason, change the slide, please. Special Operations Executive was given the task of establishing the companies and training them. It did so as Special Operation 104. Personnel were recruited for the training team. Lieutenant Colonel John Moorhood, who was actually from MI5, Captains Freddie Spencer Chapman and Michael Calvert. Several senior non-commissioned officers, all with specialised skills, were employed. The project was treated as top secret and Australia was not informed. As fate would have it, Brudenell-White was killed in an aircraft crash on the 13th of August 1940, and with that died all first-hand knowledge of the agreement that he had made to establish Australian independent companies. However, In November 1940, the team arrived at Melbourne aboard the SS Rimmeltaka. Local authorities were taken by surprise, and due to the weapons, maps, and radios aboard the Rimmeltaka, it was assumed that the team were Nazi agents and they were arrested. Thankfully, this confusion did not last long. The team was acknowledged as British and that they were to set up a training mission, even though no one had any idea what it was. A base for the training camp was established at Tidal River in Wilson's Promontory, southern Victoria. This site was chosen because it had varied terrain and its harsh climatic conditions. It was hoped that this would help to acclimatise the trainees to the conditions that they would experience on active service. The camp was given the innocuous title Number 7 Infantry Training Centre, which would obscure what was actually going on there. Jason, change the slide, please. Training the companies. Recruiting for the independent companies was entirely voluntary, but only open to members of the AIF. Volunteers were not told what they were actually volunteering for, just that it was special and hush-hush. Motivations of the men who applied were that they were bored with army routine and wanted something interesting, that they wanted to get at the enemy and felt that the army was preventing them doing so, and some of them were attracted by the increased pay for the independent companies. Volunteers were personally interviewed. They were told what they were volunteering for and the nature of the task they would do. They were asked what they could contribute to such a group. Once accepted into the training program, volunteers were sent to the training camp. Jason, change the slide, please. The training program was a highly organised affair, carefully considered and well documented. Training revolved around 5 main areas. These were physical fitness, weapons and demolition, navigation in the field, survival in the wilderness, and signalling. Michael Calvert dealt with demolitions, Spencer Chapman with navigation and the wilderness. Both were experts in their fields. Training for the volunteers was nothing like that undertaken by the regular army. It involved the following: the use of every form of infantry weapon, knowledge of Morse code and the ability to send it, the ability to navigate at day and night without a compass, the use of demolitions, the ability to survive without supplies in the wilderness, and to work effectively as part of a small team. If during training a soldier physically or psychologically did not meet the standards, he would be returned to his unit without any repercussions. A soldier could also, at any time he decided, leave the unit if he wished. There were 3 independent companies raised, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd. Companies were larger than normal companies, 226 men with a doctor and medical staff, signallers and engineers. In September 1941, the British training mission left Australia. The intention was that the training program would continue under the tutelage of Australian trainers. The Australian Army, however, had other intentions. And now that the British team had departed, it acted promptly and closed down the independent company training program. The situation remained so until the 8th of December 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and launched their offensive in Southeast Asia. Unprepared and in something of a panic, the army reached out in every direction to muster itself and reactivated the independent company training program. But before we begin to tell the story of the independent companies at war, we need to explain what happened to the first independent company. Change the slide, please. The training program of the first independent company was interrupted before it was completed. and it was deployed to Kaviyoung in New Ireland in June 1941. It was then broken up into penny packets and scattered across the island chain to the north of Australia from New Ireland to Vila in the New Hebrides. When war came in December, the company was unable to mount any sort of effective resistance and was quickly overrun by the Japanese. Tragically, many of those taken prisoner died aboard the Montevideo Maru when it was sunk by an American submarine. Only 63 of the company managed to find their way back to Australia. The first independent company was never re-established. Change the slide, please. Now, because of the time limitations, I will look at 3 examples of the independent companies at war. This is not to disparage those companies which I do not mention, but simply a constraint due to the limited amount of time I have to present the story to you. Change the slide, please. The attributes characteristic of the independent companies were initiative, independence, autonomy, innovation, aggression, resilience, and persistence. I will focus on these as we examine the story of the independent companies at war. New slide, please. Surrender Be Fucked, the second independent company on Timor. When second independent company received its orders to move, it was not told where it was being moved to. Rumours abounded, and it was decided that they were being sent to Zanzibar. It was only when they were aboard the ship that they were told that their destination was Timor. On arrival in Timor, Sparrow Force, the AAF garrison of Timor, had been told nothing about them and was not prepared. There was no specific function assigned to them, and eventually it was decided that the company would most probably be useful defending an airfield. It was not until the 16th of December 1941 that a specific task for the company was found. It was decided to send 155 men of the company and 260 Dutch infantry to Dili in Portuguese East Timor. The balance of the company, some 55 men, would follow on the 22nd of December. The object of the exercise was to protect the Portuguese colony from the Japanese and prepare the airfield at Dili for demolition. Such protection was to be offered with or without the consent of the neutral Portuguese government. As it turned out, the Portuguese did not resist the arrival of the Australian and Dutch troops, and second independent company quickly set about preparing Dili airfield for demolition and reconnoitring the surrounding countryside. The commander of second, Major Alan Spence, was an officer who firmly understood his role as the commander of an independent force. He quickly took matters into his own hands. Under Spence's guidance, the company set about preparing food and ammunition caches in the hinterlands, mapping the terrain to locate every point which could be used for ambush, observation, or concealment, which was a fortuitous exercise considering future events. On the night of the 19th to the 20th of February 1942, the anticipated Japanese invasion of Timor occurred. Sparrow Force in Dutch Timor was overwhelmed by Japanese infantry, parachutists, and tanks, and after a dogged but doomed defence, was forced to surrender. The Japanese assault on Dili came on the night of the 19th of February. This had been expected, but the actual event surprised everyone. Second was scattered in and around Dili as well as out at their base at Three Spurs. Telephone communication in Dili had failed. Japanese troops moved on Dili airfield. Lieutenant Jerry Mackenzie and No. 2 section met them on the airfield, killing several of them. The next morning, however, Mackenzie was forced to withdraw due to Japanese reinforcements. As the Japanese advanced on Dili, 2nd ambushed 2 Japanese battalions. They killed numerous Japanese, including an officer who was riding a horse. 2nd then withdrew to previously established rendezvous locations, establishing a headquarters. With no idea what had happened elsewhere in Timor, it was decided to continue to resist the enemy. This initial contact with the enemy demonstrated the ability of the company to think ahead, to make preparations, to react quickly and aggressively, to withdraw when circumstances indicated further resistance was pointless, and the esprit de corps to maintain the determination to resist and the cohesion and the purpose to do so. The company withdrew into the hinterland, abandoning masses of munitions and equipment, which was destroyed. There was no communication with the outside world. Those transmitters that 2nd possessed did not have the range to reach Australia. On the 9th of March, a Dutchman told them that Sparrow Force had surrendered. Even though this news hit the men hard, it was decided that the company would fight on. Aggressive patrolling was begun. Patrols hunted isolated Japanese, ambushing and killing them. Clashes with the enemy were frequent, with numerous Japanese being killed. At this time, the Japanese made the first of 2 demands for the Australians to surrender. In this, they stressed that all the other Allied soldiers on Timor and throughout the Netherlands East Indies had surrendered, and that if 2nd continued to resist, they would be considered as brigands and treated accordingly. 2nd officially replied to this in a rather legalistic manner, saying that as they were a unit directly under the command of headquarters in Australia, it had to wait for permission from Australia before it could surrender. The actual discussions about the demand to surrender in the 2nd headquarters were far less proper, with one response being "surrender be fucked," a sentiment not forwarded to the Japanese. A supreme example of initiative and innovation occurred on the 22nd of April, when contact with Australia was made using a transmitter which had been assembled from scavenged parts. This was a vitally important event and allowed the coordination of the delivery of supplies and movement of personnel between Australia and Timor. Supply was delivered by aircraft, Hudsons, and small vessels called kuru, which provided the ability for limited personnel movement. Radios from Australia allowed every unit in 2-2 to be linked, and an important factor in the 100 kilometres of front that they operated in. It was essential in the guerrilla war being fought that each man, while working as part of a disciplined small team, exhibit individual independence and autonomy. These were exactly the traits that Spencer Chapman had trained them in. Harassing the Japanese continued. At one time, the company raided Dili itself. The Japanese became somewhat paranoid and began to blame every mishap that occurred on the Australians. In June, a second offer to suit for 2-2 to surrender was made by the Japanese, assuming that the Australians were in a bad way because one of them had been seen without a shirt. The Japanese appealed to the Australians, guaranteeing that they would not be mistreated if they were surrendered. But once again, this demand was refused. In August, the Japanese suddenly embarked on a determined effort against 2-2. They had received reinforcements and concentrated 2,000 troops and 1,000 pro-Japanese Timorese. The Japanese had been working on the Timorese population using bribery and coercion and had persuaded some of them to cooperate with them. 4 columns were organised, with one pushing from the north, one from the south, and 2 columns from the vicinity of Dili. 2nd was faced with a major problem. They could not match the Japanese numbers, and were reluctant to give up ground. It was decided to contest every ridge and spur and to ambush as much as possible. But 2nd was compelled to concede some 30 kilometres of ground. It became obvious that the Japanese must prevail. Faced with this, once again, the character of the company asserted itself. There was no thought of surrender. It would be fight and die. The company planned to assault one of the columns head on and go down fighting. When their attack occurred, to the utter surprise of 2nd, no Japanese could be found. They had withdrawn. The reasons why this occurred remained a mystery and are still being debated. The war entered a new phase. The Japanese now had greater control of the Timorese population and intensified their work to dominate them. Left with little choice but to obey or die, many Timorese conceded to the Japanese. Armed bands of Timorese began to be sent out against the Australians. Such bands would normally number about 50 or 60 and be accompanied by a handful of Japanese armed with light machine guns. Clashes with Timorese became frequent, while fights with Japanese, who were no longer venturing forth in large numbers, became less so. In September, the army sent reinforcements to Timor. These reinforcements were the 2nd 4th Independent Company, one of the companies who'd been trained following the re-establishment of the Independent Company training program. The Japanese continued to push into areas in which Timorese support for the Australians could come from. Both 2nd and 2nd 4th fought many engagements, mostly against Timorese. No matter how well a guerrilla campaign is conducted, it imposes massive physical demands on the men conducting it. 2nd had been engaged with the Japanese since February without a break, and they were physically and psychologically exhausted. There was some debate in Australia what to do, with some arguing to leave 2nd on Timor and others to withdraw them. But in the end, it was decided to withdraw 2nd from Timor. This occurred between the 10th and the 16th of December 1942. This left 2nd 4th alone on Timor. The Japanese used Allied Timorese to burn out and loot the villages of uncommitted Timorese. This further reduced the areas 2nd 4th could gain sustenance from. By the 31st of December, the final vital food producing area was about to be overrun by the Japanese. It was decided to evacuate 2nd 4th from Timor. This happened on the 10th of January 1943 aboard the destroyer HMAS Arunta. A small party remained behind to act as observers, but these were withdrawn by submarine on the 10th of February. It is certainly the case that the Australian Timor Independent Company soldiers deserve praise. They alone amongst formed units of the Allied troops that had been overrun by the Japanese military in the entire region refused to surrender. They fought on, exhibiting tenacity and fortitude in the most stressful of circumstances. They utilised the skills and attributes that had been inculcated into them by their training in the most determined and effective manner. Their resilience against immense odds and a very taxing physical environment was outstanding. Their thoughtful, considered and patient planning resulted in the ability to continue a campaign for 10 months against a numerically superior dominant enemy. Their innovation and initiative allowed them to catch the enemy at a disadvantage on numerous occasions, as well as re-establish vital communications with Australia when all means of such communications have been cut off. What needs to be acknowledged above all things is that the campaign they embarked on was entirely their own. They had been cut off from all contact with the army. There was no higher authority issuing instructions. The decision to fight to begin a guerrilla war was their decision alone. It was a supreme example of the autonomy and independent ethos central to the very essence of the independent companies. Change the slide, please, Jason. Right, the Bearded Barbarians, which is the third independent company in 1943. In December 1941, 3rd Independent Company was deployed to New Caledonia. This was done to prevent New Caledonia falling under the control of the Vichy government, and also to prepare the nickel and chromium mines there for demolition, which was a limited concession to one of the skills the company possessed. Once on the island, however, the Army, in an indication of its dismissive attitude towards independent companies, completely forgot about 2nd, 3rd. It seldom, if ever, communicated with them, sent them no supplies, and did not even pay them. 2nd, 3rd survived on the charity of the locals, and when the Americans arrived, on the US supply system. 2nd, 3rd returned to Australia during 1942, wearing US uniforms, armed with US weapons, and in a shambolic state. As one of its officers said, they'd spent far too much time with French women and drinking wine. Luckily for them, they came under the command of Major George Worf, who was a fire-breathing taskmaster determined to beat them back into some form of order. Worf succeeded in doing so, much to the relief of the men, with one officer saying that Worf had been sent to them by God. 2nd, 3rd was then deployed to New Guinea and was flown into Wau in January 1943 during the battle to save the town from a Japanese offensive. They went straight into action, fighting the Japanese and along with 17 Brigade, pushing them back from Wau. What followed then was a pursuit through the jungle, with 2nd, 3rd ranging out ahead of the main force, scouring the tracks and killing any Japanese they came across. Worf was an unconventional soldier. He had little time for bureaucratic delay or pomposity and pushed his men forward aggressively. In the pursuit up the track, they killed around 200 Japanese. Brigadier Murray Moton, the commander of the 17 Brigade, was a competent yet very traditional conventional soldier. He had no time for independent companies, considering them to be not proper soldiers. He and Worf were polar opposites in their ideas on how to conduct the war. Nevertheless, they managed to tolerate one another, and even though he insisted on keeping a tight hold on 2nd, 3rd, Moton did allow them to range out and kill the enemy. In April 1943, things changed. 3rd Division, commanded by Major General Stanley Savage, took over in Wau. Savage was very different to Moton. He had a finely tuned understanding of how unconventional troops could be used in the jungle. He knew Worf from previous service with him in North Africa and was able to utilise Worf effectively. Savage gave 2nd, 3rd the role of protecting the left flank of 3rd Division. Technically, this task was given to 15 Brigade, but this brigade had only 2 battalions, both militia, and could not be completely relied upon. Savage decided that Worf and 2nd, 3rd, by acting autonomously out on the flank, could establish a cordon which could not only harass the enemy, but also provide a tripwire to warn if the enemy ever tried to move against that flank. 2nd, 3rd set to work sending out long-range patrols to harass the enemy. They did this in many ways, including making use of 3 Vickers machine guns, which they have procured in New Caledonia and brought back with them against Army regulations. At one time, 2nd, 3rd captured Bodubi Ridge, which directly threatened the Japanese line of communications, and also the rear areas of the Japanese front lines. They did this by innovating tactics which they borrowed from the Japanese. These were later called terror tactics and involved screaming, shooting, throwing flares and grenades, and making maximum noise during night attacks to upset the enemy. These tactics worked, and the Japanese abandoned their dug-in positions. Terror tactics were introduced into the Army's training program following this. Japanese rear areas became unsafe, and the Japanese became highly concerned for the security of not only their lines of communication, but their forward troops. After the war, the staff of the Japanese 18th Army acknowledged this. 2nd, 3rd did have to fight two conventional battles during this time, Ambush Knoll and Timbered Knoll. Both were hard fights, which they convincingly won, demonstrating the aggressive determination inherent within the independent ethos. At the end of the Salamoa campaign, it was estimated that 2nd, 3rd had killed over 500 Japanese. 2nd, 3rd was very lucky to have Savage as their commander. He allowed them the autonomy to act as they wished, provided that what they did supported the overall goals of the 3rd Division. When he wrote his report of the Salamoa campaign, Savage signalled out 2nd, 3rd as the most important unit he had under his command during the campaign. In particular, he mentioned the intelligence related to enemy numbers and deployment and the highly detailed terrain reports delivered to 3rd Division by 2nd, 3rd. This was a high commendation indeed for one company within a division of troops. New slide, please. The Killer Bees, 2nd 8th Commando Squadron, 1944 to 1945. When the Army established the commandos from the independent companies in late 1943, it removed the independent autonomous element from the independent company equation, something that the Army had as an institution had never been comfortable with. Commando squadrons were attached to larger formations and directly tied to supporting those. The old idea of allowing them the independence to operate was done away with. However, one commando squadron, 2nd 8th, defied this model. Alone among the commando squadrons, 2nd 8th did not go to Atherton in 1944 to be retrained as commandos. It remained an independent company, although its name had been changed. The commander of the 2nd 8th was Major Norm Winning, who was the commander of the Salamoa raid in 1942 and a seasoned independent company operator. He blatantly canvassed the other commando squadrons, seeking volunteers for his squadron. His attempts were successful, and many independent company veterans who were very upset by the closing down of their old independent companies joined Winning. One such recruit was Peter Pinney. Pinney had a wild youth, hanging upside down from the Sydney Harbour Bridge as a teenager. He served with Wharf in 2nd, 3rd during the Salamoa campaign, gaining a reputation as a skilled scout. He fumed at the restrictions imposed at Atherton, and he went AWOL, finding his own way to Bougainville, where he offered himself to 2nd 8th. As a skilled, independently minded veteran jungle operator, Pinney was exactly the type of man Winning was after, and he accepted him without hesitation. In October of 1944, a short time before Pinney's arrival, 2nd 8th was deployed to Bougainville, along with the 2nd Australian Corps to relieve the Americans who were there. The commander of the 2nd Corps was Stanley Savage, who had commanded 3rd Division and 2nd 3rd Independent Company during the Salamoa campaign. Alone among the senior Australian commanders, Savage had developed a doctrine on the use of unconventional forces in the jungle and put these ideas down in an official pamphlet which was issued to Second Corps. In line with Savage's theories, 2nd 8th was given the task of going into the hinterland where, acting independently, it would guard the left flank of the main push along the coast. With liaison from higher formations being erratic at best and unable to rely on nearby infantry formations, 2nd 8th was left pretty much to themselves, which is what they preferred. They patrolled incessantly into the jungle, mapping and describing the terrain. They pushed deep into the rear of the enemy, catching and killing them in areas the enemy assumed were safe. They established a special scout group made up of jungle veterans, fluent in the local language and commanded by Claude Dunchet, the 2IC of the squadron and a decorated veteran of 2nd 7th Independent Company. To supplement this, they established a similar scout group of Indigenous men armed with Japanese weapons. These scouts moved stealthily, leaving no tracks. To do this, they wore only socks or greenskin moccasins. They possessed superb jungle skills, being able to approach enemies silently and without being seen, at one time getting to within 2 meters of the enemy undetected. 2nd 8th developed a process by which they operated. Scouts would go out, normally in groups of 2, and seek out the enemy. They would report what they found, and a standby reaction force of a section or more would quickly go out and attack what had been discovered. This system reaped a toll of the enemy and did a great deal to disrupt their rear areas. 2nd 8th was acutely aware of the human environment in which it worked. It went to great pains to work closely with the Indigenous population. In return, it received a great deal of intelligence from them, as well as assistance at times, for example, marking the places for airstrikes. In May 1945, Raffles Force, under the command of Norm Winning, was established. This consisted of 2nd 8th Commando Squadron, elements of Angao, and a company of Papuan soldiers. It was the task of Raffles Force to obtain information on enemy movements, strengths, dispositions, and topographical material. Reflective of Savage's intention to use unconventional forces aggressively, it was also to harass the enemy constantly by raids and ambushes. Raffles Force was given complete autonomy to act as it saw fit, as long as it fitted in with Savage's grand plan. Using the Papuans to protect their lines of communication, 2nd 8th pushed forward. The attitude to their task was one of aggressive determination. A mark of the brutal nature of their war was that among the 2nd 8th veterans, there was no question of offering quarter to the enemy, and they were determined to kill as many as they could. Winning's orders were to annihilate the enemy and to destroy them at all costs. The men of 2nd 8th called this collecting scalps. They kept a score of their scalps and passed this on to the divisional and corps headquarters, which encouraged them to keep doing so. Their esprit de corps was such that when ordered to take 2 weeks' leave, they refused, saying that this would give the enemy a respite from their attention and prevent them from killing them. Their greatest coup was on the 3rd of June 1945, where they ambushed and killed 46 enemy in 3 separate engagements. This was celebrated by 3rd Division, which looked forward to receiving similar reports in days to come. Personal innovation assisted the men of 2nd 8th achieve their goals. Not only things such as moccasins, but also using green gauze screens to shield their faces assisted stealth. Converting the ammunition for their Owen guns into dum-dum bullets made them deadlier to their enemy. One member of 2nd 8th described how in an ambush, they had literally cut the enemy to pieces with their close-range automatic fire. Their persistent patrolling reaped rewards when they encountered and destroyed a group of Japanese who were part of a force sent to infiltrate 2nd Corps' main base at Torokina and find and kill Savage. A Japanese POW who had been persuaded by Indigenous operatives working with Raffles' force to give himself up and was passed on to the 2nd Corps by 2nd 8th, confirmed that this had what the Japanese plan had been. In 9 months of operations on Bougainville, 2nd 8th Commando Squadron officially killed 282 Japanese, with a possible 30 more. In addition, 2nd 8th provided 3rd Division and 2nd Corps with invaluable intelligence on enemy dispositions and valuable terrain reports. 2nd 8th Commando Squadron served on Bougainville from October 1944 until the end of the war in August 1945. In that time, it had operated out to the flank of the 2nd Corps in wild jungle, using all of its skills to plan and execute operations designed to disrupt the enemy and guard against them from moving in any coordinated way against the flank of 2nd Corps. Savage, who was well aware of 2nd 8th, reading all their reports and keenly interested in their actions, acknowledged the debt that he owed to them. He particularly mentioned the highly detailed terrain reports submitted to 2nd Corps by 2nd 8th, saying that they helped him immeasurably in planning his operations. During its time on Bougainville, 2nd 8th exhibited all the attributes of the Independent Company. Independence, aggression, persistence, determination, innovation, resilience, initiative, and above all, autonomy. Now, in conclusion, I will briefly mention other independent companies that I haven't included in this presentation. During 1942, the independent companies provided in dark times an example of resilience against the enemy, both with 2nd in Timor and the 2nd 5th Independent Company, which acted as Kanga Force at Wau. Also, during 1942, the 2nd 6th Independent Company provided vital assistance to US forces fighting at Buna. In 1943, the year which was really the apogee of the independent company operations, 2nd 3rd provided invaluable strategic intelligence and disrupted Japanese operations in the Salamoa campaign, while 2nd 2nd and 2nd 7th independent companies operating as Bina Force held down large numbers of Japanese troops on and near the Bina Mount Hagen Plateau, which prevented them from becoming involved in the ongoing campaign to take back Leh. The brilliant victory of 2nd 6th Independent Company at Kayapit in September 1943 demonstrated the value of both independent company autonomy and aggression in support of larger strategic objectives. During 1944 to 1945, commando squadrons operated in New Guinea with distinction, but in the role of light infantry rather than independent formations. It was 2nd 8th Commando on Bougainville which maintained the ethos and character of the independent companies. While Australia's war would still have been won without the independent companies, they undeniably added value to military operations when they were employed appropriately. It is for this and in the spirit in which they did so that we should remember them. Now, Jason asked me before to comment about the photographs which are here on, this is my book, which is available from Big Sky Publishing. It's just being published. It's available now. Now, the photograph on the front cover of that book is soldiers of Bina Force. They'll be men of either the 2nd 2nd or the 2nd 7th Independent Company. and you can get a bit of an idea about the sort of people, the sort of men that they were. You know, they were not at all your conventional soldiers. They're very much very independently minded men. I'd like to thank you now for allowing me to speak to you this evening, and it's been a great honour to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gregory. That was tremendous. And I will open the floor up. We have one question already. Graham Miller says to you, thanks for the presentation, Greg. Was it widely known that the 2nd 8th was using dum-dum bullets?
No, I found that in a letter home from Peter Pinney to his mum, and he mentioned doing it. And I would suggest that if he was doing it, others were doing it too.
Okay. I've got a question. You talk a whole lot about the numbers of Japanese that are killed.
Yeah.
You haven't said anything about the cost on the independent companies, deaths and
their losses during jungle patrolling were not very heavy because they were seldom seen. They seldom stayed around to fight it out with the Japanese. They would hit them and, like as the name suggests, like killer bees, sting you and go. They lost more men when they were forced to fight conventional battles. They never lost very heavily, but when they did lose more, when they did lose men, they felt it because they were all very closely linked together, and they all worked together so closely that even the loss of one man would be felt. At Ambush Knoll and Timbered Knoll, the losses were, I think, around about 5 or 6 dead, with wounded, of course. 2nd, 4th in Commando Squadron, which was on Tarakan, suffered quite heavily because in classic army mentality, they were used to attack fortified Japanese positions and lost accordingly. They lost about 1/3 of their men, which for them was a tragedy.
Okay, thank you. Michael, you need to turn your speaker on, Michael.
Right. Thanks very much, Greg. That was terrific. My father served in the 2nd 8th.
Oh, good.
One of the things about the 2nd 8th, as you described their campaign in Bougainville, they had a very successful war, but for about 2 years before that, they were wandering all over New South Wales and Queensland and Northern Territory in rather pointless training exercises, and in patrolling around Darwin. They, as I understand it, they reached a point of very low morale, and it was only with their deployment to Bougainville and the takeover by Major Winning that they turned the corner and became so much more effective. Winning is recorded as saying that the soldiers that he was able to recruit from other commando squadrons were much fitter than the original 2nd 8th soldiers, because they had actually been in operations where his guys had been doing training and didn't actually get into doing anything operational until they got to Bougainville quite late in their life.
Thanks for that. You're quite correct. What happened to 2nd 8th and also the army as an institution, the army hated the independent companies. As I said, there were isolated senior officers who were excellent, who knew how to use them and appreciated them. But the army as an institution hated them. And what happened to Second Eighth was exactly the sort of thing that in a slightly lesser way happened to Second Third when they were sent to New Caledonia. They just forgot them, got rid of them. Now, Second Eighth was basically exactly that. At a time when the war was going on in New Guinea and they could have been used there, what the army did with them was, for 2 years, had them patrolling up and down between Darwin and Daly River, doing nothing, literally. And as you say, they got very, very, very disenchanted and very angry. And at one stage, the army pulled 80 of their best, fittest men out to send them off to be part of the Australian Parachute Battalion, which of course was never used. And Winning's company was depleted by 80 men to begin with. And as you said, that when Winning took over the company, he knew exactly what he had to do with them. And that's why he recruited the other men from the other companies to get them in, to bolster his own men up, to give them some sort of a sense of belonging, and to sort of mold them into an effective company again. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, they misused them terribly, but that wasn't unusual. The army tended to do that a lot with them.
Winning was also reported as saying that Bougainville is nothing but a bloody self-supporting POW camp.
Yeah,
because the
it's
Japanese,
funny, you know, but Winning was totally opposed to the campaign. He thought it was a total waste of time. However, he was there, and because he was there, he was insistent that what he was going to do was do his job, do his duty, but he was not going to risk one of his men's lives unnecessarily. And that's why he insisted on being allowed to patrol as they wanted to in the jungle, because he said that was the safest way of operating, because the Japanese would not see them. They would not be ambushed by the Japanese. They would hit the Japanese and disappear. And therefore, he would not unnecessarily lose men. He didn't want to lose them in what he thought was a wasteful campaign.
No. Thank you. That was a really a good presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
John Davies has made a comment, Gregory. Thanks for a wonderful, energised presentation. Major Rolf Baldwin was on Timor, and I think Bernard Callanan also.
Yeah, Callanan, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any more questions? Here we go. John, you could ask that yourself.
No, John, I can tell, like, I'm sorry, I haven't seen that. If it wasn't to do with independent companies or commandos, I wouldn't have seen it.
Andrew Kilsby, would you turn your speaker on, your mic on? Andrew, we can't hear you. Your mic is off.
All right, what about now?
Yep, got it now.
Some of you may know this already, but Mike Calvert, when he left Australia, was sent to Burma and ran the bush warfare school at Myamyo in northern Burma. And in that capacity, he trained up the commandos that subsequently went into China, including 50 Australians, so-called Tulip Force, under military mission 240. And when the Japanese invaded, Calvert did a retreat, as part of the British retreat at that time in 42, with the commandos still in the barracks that at the time at the Bush Warfare School. Most of the Australians had already left, and 3 of the commandos were left behind, the Australians, at the Bush Warfare School. One of them was, 2 of them were killed, and one of them was captured by the Japanese, and he was recovered in 45. And of course, for those of you who know your SOE history and so on, Spencer Chapman, of course, became rather famous later because he did a lot of behind the lines work in Southeast Asia. Quite a renowned operative in that regard. But that's an interesting connection with Calvert, I just thought.
Yeah, and Andrew Calvert also worked with Ord Wingate and the Chindits. He became a brigadier.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
later career. Yeah.
Oh, they were amazing fellows. That both of them. Spencer Chapman was an incredible man. He was sort of like a character out of a boy's own adventure novel. I mean, what he'd done in his life up until that stage when he came to Australia, he'd sailed single-handedly in a boat around Greenland. He trekked across Lapland with reindeer. He climbed the Himalayas and lived with the monks in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
He'd written books about it. I mean, he was an absolute expert on survival in the wilderness.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, and then, as you say, that when the Japanese invaded Malaya, he went into the jungle and he lived there for years.
Yeah, stayed there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Force 136, which was the SOE operation in Malaya and Burma and Thailand, they actually sent in parties to find him because he'd been so long, but he was still going just fine.
He was a very amazing man, and
yeah, one of the Air Force guys that I'm working on at the moment in the Burma campaign flew up to Lhasa in Tibet and found a guest book with Spencer Chapman's name in it at some obscure little B&B in Lhasa, Tibet.
Yeah, that'd be about right. Yeah.
Okay, are there any more questions or statements?
Can I make something? Just say something quickly, Brent?
Yes.
Sorry, Greg. My father was part of the 2nd 40th Battalion, Sparrow Force in Dutch Timor.
Yeah.
And he was one of the ones that wasn't captured, and they ended up with the 2nd Independent Company.
Yeah.
And he wasn't evacuated until December 42, along with the Independent Company. And I think it was about 100 or 150 Sparrow Force people basically joined up in the Independent Company, and they formed a separate company, a separate platoon.
Yeah.
Of the survivors from Timor, from Dutch Timor.
Yeah, they did that. They took in quite a few characters from the AAF. What they were saying was they weren't all infantry though. They had quite a few second line people. Like they had mechanics, and they had, I think one guy was a refrigerator mechanic. I mean, they weren't real. They had to retrain them.
Yes, my father was.
They said that when they had them with them and when they worked with them, they were fine. You know, they did a good job. Yeah.
My father was a quartermaster, staff sergeant.
Yeah.
But they still kept him there until December. They didn't let him go back on the early flights.
I imagine they'd use his organisational talents.
Probably, yes. He never spoke about it, of course.
No, yeah. But yes, it's as I say, they were very, 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 very flexible, and they had to be, to survive. Yeah.
Now we have one last query, Jeffrey, and then we'll close, I think. This is from Guy Warnock. How can we get an autographed copy of your book? ? Very important commercial plug.
Yeah, I don't know. You could write to me and get one, because I'm going to have a few of them here. Do you have my address, Brent?
We can organise that later. Jason will be sending out information.
I'm going to have a few copies of the book here, and if somebody wants me to autograph it and send it to them, I can.
Okay, well,
yeah.
would do that through. Are you happy to do that, Jason? I can't.
Yeah, Greg, just send me the details of where you or how you want people to contact you about the book, and I'll send that out to them.
That's all right. Yeah.
Okay.
I believe it's distributed through Simon & Schuster and a number of other resellers, but getting an autograph copy would be through you.
It would have to be, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Greg. Been tremendous. We'll move on now. We've got several other bits of business for the audience. MHHV business. If you want to stay, by all means do. If you want to leave, it's
I have to leave. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's good. That's fine. I'm rather
Thank you.
good.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you.
Been tremendous. Thank you. And you've got the next notice up? Yes, indeed. So we have 3 events coming up, quite well spaced. The first one will be in September the 4th. It is our Military History and Heritage Annual General Meeting. That's in the bottom left-hand corner. Be held online, and those details, they'll be coming out to you. Please feel free to join us. The second one will be the next speaker event, which is Great Courage and Initiative, the heroic life of George Ingram, VC and Military Medal. He got the Military Medal in 1917 and the VC in 1918, and then went on to fight in the Second World War as an engineer. So that'll be very interesting. And there is an upcoming conference. I better just make this big enough so I can see it. In the fight, sorry, Australians in the war in Burma, 1942 to 1945, one-day conference, Saturday, the 16th of November. So those 3 events are coming up. So Jason will keep you apprised of all the details, but put them in your diaries. Be good to see you there. And this brings us to the end of the session. Thanks to Gregory, thanks to Jason, as always, for keeping things going behind the scenes, and thank you for joining us. Hope you come again. Good night from the committee and myself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.